We're back with you tonight here on In Focus. We now talk to Ian Cameron, the founder of firearms.co.za, about the importance of collecting gun residue evidence from witnesses at a crime scene. Ian, good evening and thank you very much for your time and for joining us tonight. Why is gunshot residue still a viable form of physical evidence in murder trials like the one currently on in Pretoria?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that gunshot residue is similar to DNA in a sense that it can play a crucial role not only to indicate that someone had physical contact with a firearm or was in the direct area, probably between 1.5 to 2 meters around a firearm that was going to be or that was discharged, but it also can link someone to a crime scene. So it is crucial that gunshot and gun propellant residue is preserved at all costs. In fact, the entire crime scene, as we know, unfortunately, as we've seen in the case, as you just discussed, there might be discrepancies regarding that, but it's incredibly important that the procedure is followed correctly when it comes to gunshot residue.
Testing then of certain materials, I believe, on the hands and on the clothes is what you're looking at that could possibly tell you or can determine what you've just said. Now, how specific is this examination? What are the processes?
Let me run you through the very basic process without going into too much detail for time constraints, but basically it means that when you fire a firearm, there is gunshot or primer residue and propellant that is released around you. So any gap or any open part of the firearm would expel some of this propellant or residue rather, and that residue has to come to rest somewhere, whether it's on your skin or a wall next to you, on the floor, something around you. Usually they say the time lapse for such a test is around 2.5 hours, so it's crucial that forensic experts get to the scene as soon as possible. Obviously, I'm talking about it in a very academic sense. I know cases differ and the reporting of cases differ. It's also important to understand that many times cases are actually thrown out of court due to a lack of evidence and because of evidence that was actually contaminated. Nevertheless, what basically happens when you fire this firearm is that a hammer or a firing pin hits the back of the cartridge, it hits the primer, and this causes for basically a chemical reaction to take place and for the release of certain chemicals, and it then causes for a projectile that we all know is a bullet to be released from the cartridge. And obviously with that, it's almost, how can I basically explain it, like an explosion, a very small explosion that happens on the inside of the firearm. That bullet is then discharged and it causes this certain vapor, a very high temperature vapor that comes out outside of the firearm and obviously covers the hands. Now, someone that actually fires the firearm or handles the firearm directly would clearly have more gunshot residue or propellant residue even on their hands than someone that was just in the close proximity. But if someone was standing right next to the person pulling the trigger, it might obviously, or it might mean that they have high amounts of it.
So then that brings that question, before we get to the other question that I want to put to you, but the question of cross-contamination, it could occur, and this is what you're referring to, if you're close enough. To what extent could that undermine evidence?
It shouldn't necessarily undermine it. Was the scene correctly preserved? So what should happen typically is that as soon as the crime occurs, whoever reacts to the scene firstly, nothing should be cleaned. Nothing should be removed or cleaned. Anyone that might be a witness or that was inside the property or on the property or in the direct area where the incident occurred should be kept there for questioning, for note, etc., everything that needs to follow up from there. So it's crucial that those interviews happen. So cross-contamination as such shouldn't really be a problem, was the process followed properly. But unfortunately, we very often see, especially in areas where communities are living very close and in a high frequency to each other, that everyone runs to the crime scene to see what's happening, and obviously then we see that a crime scene is contaminated. And unfortunately, we also see that people either clean up crime scenes for criminal sake, or they clean up to make it easier for victims who survive, to make it supposedly less traumatic for them, which I often understand. But unfortunately, this means that entire investigation is literally washed down the drain.
Can gunshot residue be completely removed? I tell you why, because we're hearing that the forensic officer didn't bother testing the inhabitants of the house because they were already moving. So possibilities that gun residue would have been removed anyway in the normal movement of the people. So can it be removed in the normal movement of people? Can it be removed through washing?
Sure. You would really need to do a very, very good chemical job to get all of that off. I would personally say no. In the context of the trial that's currently ongoing, I don't see how they would be able to do that. It just wouldn't make sense to me. If he says it comes from the general moving on people, I think it's a blatant lie, to be honest. It just doesn't work that way. It can obviously become less. It can deteriorate over time. But if someone fired a firearm or discharged a firearm, the amount of gunshot residue on their hands is quite a bit. They would literally, if they didn't fire it to get that amount, they would literally have to hold the firearm, handle it, take out rounds, fill up a magazine, etc. But they would literally need to work with the firearm. So no, it's not something that you can remove that easily. It doesn't work that way.
Let's move on then to the other piece of evidence that is considered vital, bullet shells, and the unique set of scratches and grooves and dents on bullet shells, and how extensive is the admissibility of that, and how could it help as evidence?
Well, when you look at a cartridge, so what basically happens, back to the explanation of earlier, as soon as that round or that firearm is discharged, a cartridge is released from the firearm, and a semi-automatic firearm automatically then pushes the next round into the chamber for the next round to then be fired as the trigger is pulled. But that empty cartridge, after a bullet has been discharged from the cartridge, then obviously lands on the floor of the scene, etc. It's crucial that is preserved. So firstly, if someone was loading a magazine of a firearm, they would usually use their bare hands. Some criminals might not, but in general people would, and that means there would be fingerprints on there. So that's one piece of evidence that can play a crucial role as to who loaded those rounds into a magazine of a firearm. Also, every single cartridge is unique, and you would be able to match it to that specific firearm. So if you were able to find the alleged murder weapon, which, say, for example, could be a 9mm parabellum pistol, then you would be able to, with the correct ballistic, specific firearm according to the way that the grooves inside the barrel of that firearm, sorry, not in the barrel, according to the grooves on the cartridge and how the firing pin hit the primer on the back of the cartridge happened. Each one of those is unique, and it's literally micromillimeters difference that some of them might have. But nevertheless, those grooves, etc., caused by the firearm and the use of that firearm would obviously mean that you would be able to match it to a specific firearm, and then obviously to a specific crime.
Yeah. How extensive is our ballistics database? And by that I mean images that the authorities have, because I believe that's how you conduct this matching of the various casings, cartridges, and the bullets fired in terms of the specific signature and the unique markings. So how extensive is our ballistics database?
I don't think it's extensive enough. I don't have an exact figure for it, just because it's not something that's referred to very often in public, at least. But what I can tell you, and I want to refer to the Julius Malema firearm discharge case, because I was involved in laying the criminal charges with that specific case, is that in that specific case, it was crucial that the cartridges that were picked up were then later, according to my understanding, tested and compared to the rifles, several rifles that belonged to the security firm of his then bodyguard. And obviously, and we need to wait for the case to continue, but obviously had those cartridges then matched those specific firearms, you wouldn't even need a previous database. You could match them straight away. So for the database, it would basically mean that you would have needed previous ballistic tests to have been done on that specific firearm in order to match a cartridge to it. So I don't think it's extensive enough, and obviously when you buy a firearm or you get a firearm illegally, the chances of that having been tested for ballistics before, at least by the state, are very, very small.
What are the chances of false positive match? In other words, bullets fired from different guns having similar markings. I tell you because there's a whole debate around whether a revolver or whatever other gun was actually used in this particular murder.
The chances are very small if you're speaking about different types of firearms. If you, for example, have a .38 special revolver, there's no doubt that it was a .38 special revolver if that's the casing that was picked up on the scene, that was found on the scene. So there's no debate around what type of cartridge was found, unless the cartridges weren't really found and you couldn't see what caliber that specific cartridge was. So I think that's the first point. I can't really see it being a false positive, because if the right microscope and ballistic testing work is done, the majority of those grooves, if let's rather say, if the correct expert is working on the scene, it really shouldn't be a problem. And according to my knowledge, we still have quite a few very, very knowledgeable forensic experts working within the South African Police Service with regards to ballistic testing, at least. If you look at something like the Marikana investigation, perfect example. I mean, there were literally hundreds of rounds that had to be analyzed, and every single one of those rounds could be matched to a specific firearm.
Ian Cameron, appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on tonight. He is founder of firearms.co.za.